Arthur Stevens, Melbourne.
From bureaus worldwide, this is FSN.
Thanks very much, Ollie. How you doing? It's Wednesday, the 13th of March 2019. I am, of course, Richie Allen. Mostly a Brexit-free zone today. Promised you that yesterday. I'm a man of my word. Hope you're well.
Welcome back to the most listened to independent radio show in Europe. It's your Richie Allen Show.
Yes, one or two of my guests might have something to say on it, but we're going to steer clear of it in the monologue today. You'll be glad to hear, I think. Hey, I think so. Let's get on with it.
It's the Richie Allen Show. Broadcasting live on richieallen.co.uk and multiple platforms around the world. And now, here's your host, Richie Allen.
Now, coming up this hour, Russell Whiting, who campaigns for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's a peace activist and he's a regular guest on RT Russia Today. Russell is joining the programme for the first time. We're going to talk about the UK arms trade, its sales to Saudi Arabia and its weapons sales in other parts of the world and the devastation caused by that. Russell is very good. I'm looking forward to chatting with him this hour. And in the second hour, Tom Quiggin, host of the popular Quiggin Report, returns to the programme. Tom is a Canadian. He's also the author of the book Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America. We're not going to be focusing so much on that. Lots to talk about with Tom. And he is a former aeronautical engineer. So we'll talk about airplanes and the 737 and Ethiopia and all of that. We'll get into that with Tom as well in the second hour. As usual, if you'd like to contribute, just tweet the programme between now and 7 p.m. That's about it, isn't it? Yeah. So it'll be Brexit free. You know what's happening. To be fair to the likes of the BBC and the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, and wretched as the UK mainstream media is, today it's just given a play-by-play account. If you want to catch up with it, check out the MSM. I'm going to leave it. May got hammered last night. Tonight there will be a vote on whether to take no deal off the table. There's nothing else to say. I know Tom Quiggin will have one or two things to say in the second hour, but as I said, we'll be dealing with a wide range of newsworthy items or issues with Tom. It won't be Brexit-centric at all. All right. So it's going to be an interesting programme then. Hey, big news, major news. And you mightn't have heard this, but God, that's holy God, the baby Jesus. Some people refer to him as the baby Jesus. God is preparing to give humans, presumably that's us, the blueprint for Satan's plan. God's going to give us the blueprint for Satan's plan because there is a spiritual battle taking place in the world today, and patriots will be given the keys to victory if they stay connected to God. Who says this? Infowars' Alex Jones said it. Apparently he's on vacation, but there's no rest for the wicked. Because Alex phones in to chat with his stand-in on his own programme, like you would normally do on vacation, of course. God has the blueprints. This is Alex Jones. Thank God I checked in with Alex for the first time in months. Listen to this.
God wants humanity to ask for the blueprints to Satan's plan so that we can stop it. Because God is a free will God and is the true God, the one God. And that's what this comes down to, is that literally the enemy blueprint is in front of us. It's an anti-human blueprint. It's a wood-chipping machine to destroy all of us, and we must stand against it. And I'm glad you're pointing that out, because covering all the politics is only a way to show people the enemy's design. It is a good versus evil paradigm. That's what it comes down to.
Wow. So how does God send you the blueprints? FedEx, maybe? Or by Amazon drone? Nah. Amazon drone is the devil. So God probably wouldn't use Amazon drones. Gets better, this. Alex is actually phoning in from a hotel on his holiday. And at the hotel, there are Muslims and gays. Muslims and gays there. Two groups with destructive qualities, according to Alex. And he can't get his head around what the left is doing. This is comedy gold. Alex from the hotel with the gays and the Muslims.
Why would the left channel, even where I've been on vacation for 5 days at this particular hotel, they have like a gay wedding here. And you...
I've been on vacation for 5 days at this particular hotel, they have a gay wedding here. I could have been fairly naughty and chopped up some of that and made it sound different. But anyway, he's at a hotel, vacation, 5 days. There's a wedding there. It's a gay wedding. Don't know how he can stand it, to be honest. But he's there in the trenches.
You've got a bunch of Muslims here at the same time who are...
And there's Muslims!
Who are sitting there with their women wearing burqas and hijabs and looking disgustingly at these gay men, and the gay men all kissing their ass right next to them.
Whose ass are the gay men kissing? Each other's asses or the asses of the Muslims? I'd have jumped in and asked him, but the stand-in, Alex's lackey, doesn't want to get involved in this one. So it's a gay wedding, gays and Muslims. The Muslims are looking disgustingly at the gays as the gays are enjoying the wedding. Alex is right there in the middle of it. What else? What happened?
And you just have to understand that's two cultures that don't even get along, but aren't even on the same wavelength, except they're both destructive. And the left is trying to bring all this in. They're trying to set all this up. They're trying to do this. There's another article on Infowars.com in Germany where the woman's murdered by a Muslim. So a Muslim goes to the goes to the funeral. This is a wedding of death, and screams Allah Akbar. And then, as you mentioned, YouTube censoring bad reviews of leftist movies. I mean, this is where they're going. And then I didn't even get into this. I'll cover it with you obviously tomorrow and Paul Watson. I'll be back tomorrow, but I've got to deal with the depositions.
Oh, he's got to deal with the depositions. God knows what legal trouble he's up to his neck in. So the left is bringing together the gays and the Muslims. Run for your lives! The guy standing in for Alex, by the way, is the biggest. Say it right, Rich. In my opinion, the biggest brown noser there's ever been. If you thought Paul Joseph Watson was bad, wait till you hear the guy who's standing in for Alex. His tongue is so far up Jones's arse, it's actually licking his teeth. Listen to this.
Alex, I've been talking a lot about having God's vision today, and, I think a lot of people don't fully understand what we do here at InfoWars because a lot of it is quite frankly, just trying to channel God and just fighting the devil in this spiritual battle. But having God's discernment, there's certain things, Alex, that I've experienced with you where you'll say something to me and I'll be like, wow, Alex. And then a couple months later, it comes to full fruition and I'm like, oh my gosh.
Pull your tongue out of my arsehole, Gary. Dogs do that. You're not a dog, are you, Gary?
You're not a dog, are you, Gary? Pull your tongue out of my arsehole, Gary. Infowars. Hadn't listened to any of it for months and months and months. Thank God. I was down in the dumps today. I got absolutely drenched into the skin out running this morning with the dog. I was like a drowned rat. Came in looking at the news, fed up with it, and switched on a bit of Infowars. Thank God I did. Buy my super male vitality pills and we'll get you God's blueprint for Satan's plan FedEx to you at the speed of light. It is 12 and a half minutes past the hour. There's a story in the Daily Mail today about hate speech, about an Edinburgh University lecturer who tweeted a quote from the film Trainspotting, which stars, of course, some very, very good, very talented people like Ewan McGregor, of course, Robert Carlyle, Kelly MacDonald is in it, and so on, so on. Anyway, he tweeted a quote by the character Renton, and the police got involved. I'm pushed for time here, so I won't get into that, but I know Tom Quiggin wants to talk about this in the second hour. It's important as well. Let's talk about some more serious things. John Wedger was on with me yesterday, the former detective, and as you know, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse is hearing allegations about the Westminster phase, right? Well, it's the Westminster phase. They're hearing allegations about politicians. Boris Johnson, apparently, the former foreign secretary, has caused outrage by claiming that millions of pounds spent investigating these allegations is money that is, quote, spaffed up the wall. He said this on LBC to Nick Ferrari today, and people are coming out of the woodwork to condemn him. This is what Boris Johnson had to say.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. Well, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now? What the people want is to see officers out on the streets doing what they signed up to do.
Yeah, LBC. Opposition members of Parliament, you won't be surprised, ran frantically to their smartphones and tablets to tweet the most wonderful virtue signalling tweets because Boris had given them an open goal. This one made me laugh. It's a tweet from a woman called Laura Pidcock. Great names the English have. These Sassenachs, they've great surnames, don't they? Pidcock. What the hell is that? I used to laugh when Chris Tarrant was introducing the contestants on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because that's how it started. The music would be playing and you'd see the contestants in a row and Tarrant would name them. And I used to think in Ireland years ago, they've got these ridiculous names. Let's meet the contestants. Sally Munge. Where the fuck does Munge come from? Laura Pidcock. I'm like, where did they get these names? And I said this to an English guy once and he said, Shut your cake hole, Hanrahan. Hanratty. All right, fair enough. It's just as bad in Ireland then. Right. Anyway, Laura Pidcock, hearing Boris Johnson, tripped over herself, split herself open, running to she didn't do that, to get to a phone to tweet. Deeply hurtful and offensive comments by @Boris Johnson. In my work, I've met with many who've suffered the most horrific sexual abuse. To say resources spent on bringing them justice is spaffing money up the wall is beneath contempt, not fit for public office. Simple as that. Get over yourself, love. It's always about them, isn't it? Me. Look at me. Look, I've met with many victims. I bet you if you stood in front of her, the saucy old cow couldn't name a single person and would flaff about and then say, oh, well, I can't breach confidentiality. Me. If Laura Pidcock was interested in the inquiry, she would be asking an urgent question in Parliament today. I know today is difficult, but she would ask an urgent question about MI5 and whether MI5 is fit for purpose, because MI5 has admitted that Peter Morrison, Cabinet Minister, had a penchant for young boys, but that MI5 didn't tell the police. And MI5 acknowledged that former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher knew this but kept Morrison around. So virtue signalling from the lunatic Social Democrats masquerading as socialists in Westminster, but of course avoiding the serious issues. Boris Johnson is a plonker, of course, but that's just plonker behaviour. I want to play this. I've not played this clip in over a year. Tim Fortescue, Chief Tory Whip 1970 to 1973, said this on the BBC in 1997, and it's relevant to what's happening today with the virtue signalling.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth. They'll say, no, I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons.
No, it doesn't sound nasty at all, Tim. Tim Fortescue is dead, of course. In 1997, I've said this before, but maybe not in as much detail. Why didn't senior detectives in London at the time watching that go and fetch Fortescue? Because what Fortescue admitted on national television was that he had broken the law. In fact, he had broken a law that could see him in prison for 15 to 20 years. Yes, MPs who abused young boys came to me. I buried it because then I could get them to vote certain ways on certain amendments. Nobody talks about it. So Laura Pidcock and everybody else having a go at Boris Johnson today could be tweeting about MI5 admitting that they, buried and didn't pursue information about very senior politicians abusing children and didn't pass them on to the police. It's a virtue signalling paradise. That's all that Twitter is. It's nonsense, Twitter. I look forward to the day, which is coming very soon, when I'll be deleting the Twitter account. I know you'll say, Richie, you've said this before. I have said it before. And some of you have pleaded with me not to do it, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to delete it once and for all and get rid of it. No time for it whatsoever. By the way, Boris Johnson knows that child abuse was a sport in his party. Maybe it's still going on. His dad, Stanley, would have heard things based on what Fortescue said because it was common knowledge that it was going on and that it was being covered up. Right. Washington Post yesterday, will leave child abuse for now. There was a headline that caused half of the United States alt-right to have a stroke. What was the headline in the Washington Post yesterday that caused the alt-right to have kittens? Millions of kittens evacuated from the backsides of those on the alt-right. They collapsed yesterday. The headline in the Washington Post was this: Whites now are mainly to blame for air pollution, but blacks and Hispanics bear the burden, says a new study. White people mainly to blame for air pollution, but blacks and Hispanics bear the burden. So I laughed when I read the headline. Air pollution, the leading environmental cause of death worldwide, reflects the stark racial inequalities of American life. The problem is disproportionately caused by the white majority, but its consequences are suffered mainly by blacks and Hispanics. I won't read any more of the article. Suffice to say, they refer to a study. Sounds like bullspit to me, but what do I know? It might be true. I know that child poverty and poverty in general is more prevalent among ethnic minorities, whatever the cause of it. Anyway, Tucker Carlson is a Fox News presenter. He's their latest star. He took over the mantle left by Bill O'Reilly. I like Tucker Carlson, actually. I think he's all right. He's a good host and he treats his guests well, and he's always happy to hear from his opponents, even if I don't agree with some of what he says. He says the left is fermenting racism and hatred. This is Tucker Carlson.
The left claims that it opposes racism. By now, you know the left is always projecting. What they say you're doing is what they're doing, and they're constantly fomenting racial hatred. They do it constantly, whether it's by publicizing fake hate crimes or instating racial quota systems or bringing back segregation. Sometimes it's just in their mindless coverage of news stories. This headline, this is a real headline, it ran today in the Washington Post, and we're quoting now. Whites are mainly to blame for air pollution, but blacks and Hispanics bear the burden, says a new study. Sorry, it's too funny. Let's just be clear, though. I mean, take 3 steps back. This article was designed to attack an entire group based solely on their skin color. The headline, the leading paragraphs are all meant to attack this enemy racial group in our midst and, of course, imply that they are racist. By doing what? It doesn't say. It doesn't matter. They're hurting other people. This article doesn't seek to help the environment. If it was, they could talk about overall air pollution levels, which, by the way, and the Post has even reported this, have declined dramatically in the last few decades for everybody because the factories closed. The Post could have focused on the extra air pollution caused by immigration-driven population growth or by wealthy people jetting across the country to attend, climate conferences. But they didn't. Jeff Bezos wouldn't like that. He's one of those people, and the Post know that because it's his newspaper.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson. Interest in that. We might revisit that in the near future. 23 minutes past the hour. It's 23 minutes past 5 as we go out live on Fab Radio 2, triggerwarning.tv, my website, and lots of other places as well. Big story in Italy, of course. The 5-star La Liga coalition collapsed. Collapsed, didn't it? It's not collapsed, it's still there. But it had refused, or it had given hope that it would refuse to introduce mandatory vaccinations for children in Italy. What it's done is it has allowed schools say that if children turn up to school, they will be refused entry unless they have been properly vaccinated. This follows months of debate in Italy about compulsory vaccination. I know a lot of our listeners would have been following this. They claim, the World Health Organization claims that there has been a surge in measles cases in Italy and in Europe, but they haven't provided any definitive proof of this. They haven't. Okay? I'm not saying it hasn't happened, by the way, because I don't do that, but they haven't shown any definitive proof that measles has surged in such a way that it has to be dealt with this way. So children up to the age of 6 will be excluded from nursery and kindergarten unless they can prove they were vaccinated under these new rules. It's becoming very dangerous, this. The health minister of Italy, Giulia Grillo, told La Repubblica newspaper, now everyone has time to catch up. The rules are simple, said Grillo, no vaccine, no school. Regional authorities in Italy are handling the situation in a number of different ways. In Bologna, for example, the local authority has sent letters of suspension to the parents of 300 children. Letters of suspension to 300 children's parents, and a total of 5,000 children do not have their vaccine documentation up to date. I was interviewing men and women back 10 or more years ago, and these men and women had been warning as far back as the 1980s that there would come a time when we would live in a totalitarian state where we would be told that we had no choice but to allow an official of government to stick a needle in us and to inoculate us against our will. And when people were saying that stuff back in the 1980s, they were laughed at, they were ridiculed at. They were ridiculed, I should say. I've interviewed many of these people whom have been on the case of vaccines and vaccine damage for decades, who warned about this and were called tinfoil hat wearing lunatics. I would hope that there are still enough people left in the world whom, even if they believe that vaccines are important and that they are safe, and you are entitled to believe that, I'll talk to you all day long. No problem with it. I would hope that there are still many of those people who are aghast at the notion that it has been forced on people who don't want it. That's a different thing. The argument about the safety or the efficacy of vaccines, leave that to one side. That is irrelevant right now. This is an argument about whether the state can say, we will stick a needle into your child and inject it with chemicals and you can't do anything about it. I believe, and I'm not a scaremonger or a fearmonger, it's coming here real soon, and also coming here is the threat of the removal of a child from parents who don't want to vaccinate, because family court judges will say in the future, those parents, they're in cloud cuckoo land, they're conspiracy theorists, they might be a danger to the child. This is how dangerous it's getting. It really is, folks, you know. We're going to talk in a few minutes' time about Yemen and Saudi Arabia. We're going to talk about the UK arms trade, arms sales from this country to other countries around the world, what it is doing to humanity, why there is little or no discussion of it in the mainstream media. And we're going to do that with a very interesting man called Russell Whiting. Don't forget, coming up a bit later on in the programme, Tom Quiggin of the Quiggin Report will be live on the show. Tom was really interesting last time he was on, and it'll be interesting to catch up with him again. I'm looking forward to that. So Tom Quiggin joins the programme. Before we get into that with Tom, before we get into Yemen and Saudi Arabia with Russell, let's have music from The Smiths from Manchester and Morrissey, and a song called Cemetery Gates, right? Brilliant song, this. Brilliant song from the album The Queen Is Dead on your Richie Allen Show at 28 minutes past the hour. Good to be with you, as always. Music from The Smiths, Cemetery Gates, 1986 on the Richie Allen Show. The time is exactly 5:30. Welcome to the programme if you're just joining me. A lot of tweets on the monologue. If you want to see what other people are tweeting me, just go to twitter.com, where it says search Twitter. Just put Richie Allen Show, all one word, and you will see every tweet that comes into the programme. Now, this is very serious, this, and it isn't getting a lot of coverage, especially on UK commercial, let alone national media. Let me read a brief paragraph from Time magazine. The journalist is Hilary Leong. And the headline is, "A dozen children were killed in Yemen strikes during a 2-day period," the United Nations says. Strikes in Yemen killed 22 people during a 48-hour period earlier this week, including a dozen children. In a statement on Monday, the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for the war-ravaged country said as many as 30 others were reportedly injured, among them 14 children aged between 1 and 18 in the northwest province of Hajjah. "We condemn these deaths and injuries unequivocally," said Lise Grande, humanitarian coordinator for Yemen. "We share our deep condolences with the families of the victims." Now, I pay attention to RT. I watch a lot of RT because RT will cover stories and important geopolitical events that UK mainstream media will not. And my next guest is a regular contributor to RT, and I watched a very interesting interview with him last week about thousands of civilians being killed in Yemen by bombs made in this country and in the United States. He's a peace activist, like I said, a regular contributor to RT, and he also works very closely with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's in Nottingham. Let's welcome to the programme Russell Whiting. Russell, thanks so much for giving us your time today. How are you?
I'm good, Richie. Thanks. Good to be with you.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for coming on. It breaks my heart to see you on RT last week talking about thousands of people being killed. Time magazine talking about dozens and dozens of children. Here's a question that my listeners have been asking me to put to you. Is there any legal remedy, Russell, for the people of this country to take our government to court as an accessory to murder, to genocide, or to mass murder? What can we do?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it breaks my heart to have to keep going on RT, to be honest. I'd much rather not have to do it. I'd much rather not be talking to you about this today. And I'm sure you've got other things you'd rather be talking about. But this is a really serious issue. I think one of the big problems we have in this country, Richie, right, is that these arms are being sold to Saudi. Saudi Arabia is probably the worst country we sell arms to, but not the only bad one. I think we sell arms to 18 of the top 20 human rights abusers. So we are making money off the backs of those who are killing innocent people. Now, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade has done fantastic work in trying to pursue a legal remedy, and direct action has been taken. But unfortunately, the government seems to just let all this stuff just roll off its back. You know, they're just absolutely shameless on this kind of stuff, because they trot out the same tired lines that we've all heard before about needing to maintain influence in the region. And, you know, Yemen is somehow a threat to Saudi Arabia or to us. This is just absolute nonsense, isn't it?
It's a phantom, right? It's a myth that's gone unchallenged through the media. I'm glad you said that, because our media, when you read the BBC News website, or when you read the Telegraph or the Daily Mail, they talk about a war. And I suppose people whom get their information only from those sources are under the impression that there is a war between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. But this is not true. Do you want to educate them? What is happening there?
So the situation is it is absolutely desperate, isn't it? So you have the Yemeni government, who are supported by the Saudi Arabia regime. And then you have the rebels, who have taken over elements of the country. Obviously, this is an internal conflict, and like Syria and like so many conflicts we've seen before, it becomes a proxy war, right? So you've got Iran backing the rebels, and you've got Saudi Arabia backing the government. And the situation is that Saudi Arabia, for whatever reason, whatever hold they have over the West, whether it's oil or whether it's other things, I'm not entirely sure, but they are able to suck people in to join their coalition. And it's not a war. At the minute, it is literally Saudi Arabia dropping hundreds, thousands of bombs on sitting targets. They are, the thing that really annoys me, Richie, and this doesn't get spoken about enough, we fight wars these days, dropping bombs on places as if we were fighting wars in the 1940s, where your army was in a barracks and your civilians were in the town and they didn't mix. Fighters these days place themselves in towns around civilians. You cannot drop thousands of bombs on wherever it is, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and not expect to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent people. And that is what is happening. It's not a war, what's happening in Yemen at the minute. It's a massacre. It's a massacre by Saudi Arabia of innocent women, men, and children. And it's being done with British bombs. And the thing that really annoys me, sorry, I'm ranting.
No, it's
now,
good. You've got the floor. Go ahead. We've plenty of time.
The thing that really annoys me is when you do see the occasional thing on the BBC or in the Guardian or wherever you get your news from the mainstream media, it is portrayed as a war. It's portrayed as a war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or even a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. When was the last time we heard mention of the fact that it is being executed with British weapons? I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen that, certainly not in the past year. And sometimes the most horrific weapons we can imagine being used to bomb schools, hospitals, housing estates. And we are complicit in it through the actions of our government. And it breaks my heart that the UK, whether we were ever a force for moral good in the world is obviously debatable.
Yeah.
We've just given up. We've just given up even pretending to be a force for moral good in the world now.
I had Christopher Monckton on the programme last night, former UKIP advisor and close friend of Nigel Farage. And I was arguing with him about a lot of things about the Labour Party and this and that. And he said to me, it's regrettable what's happening in Yemen. He said, to his credit, to give him a little bit of credit. And then he said, but you can't expect the government to be held accountable. We can't be responsible. He basically said they don't know that these things are going to happen. You sell these arms to these countries. You expect that they will obey the rules of war, that they will obey, they will obey the Geneva Convention. And he said they don't, and we can't be blamed for it. Now, obviously, I attacked him for saying that, but I suppose those on the right will say that. Look, we sell these arms to these people. It's not our fault if they do these things. What can we do?
Well, the answer is very simple, isn't it? What the hell do we expect them to do with these bombs that we're selling them? I mean, the Saudis aren't paying billions of pounds. I think its last count was about coming up to £4.5 billion of weapons that we've sold Saudi Arabia in the past few years. We sell £6.6 billion of arms every year out of this country. Riyadh, the regime in Riyadh is not buying our bombs to put them in a museum or to use them for educational purposes in their universities. They are obviously going to drop them on places. And even, all right, you might be able to hide behind the fact that we didn't know what was going on for the first, day, 12 hours. But we are years and years into this conflict now. The idea that we don't know what's happening is just another fig leaf, isn't it, for them to hide behind. And it's just another excuse for the arms traders and the arms sellers to make more money off the backs of ordinary people around the world who are just being bombed into oblivion.
My listeners have questions for you, and they're very interesting questions. One of them is about depleted uranium. Are these weapons still being manufactured using depleted uranium, which they excused in the past? They've used the excuse that depleted uranium is very good at cracking through very heavy defences. We know from Iraq, of course, that it leaves a terrible legacy, does terrible things to people. Are depleted uranium munitions still being used in this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've seen no evidence that there's been a complete stop. As with so much of this, it's secret, it's going on behind the scenes, it's going on behind closed doors. And one of the other big issues with places like Yemen and Syria is the local infrastructure on the ground has been so depleted that we don't often know actually what's happening. And it's not until many years later. And I think I recall instances of depleted uranium being used in Afghanistan. I don't think there's been any evidence of it in Yemen, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and white phosphorus and stuff. These are questions coming in now. White phosphorus is a terrible, terrible thing. You can educate my listeners better as to what it is. You have to suspect that these things have just not disappeared. They're still around. It costs a lot of money to make this stuff, so they're hardly likely to, as you said, leave it in a cupboard or in a museum. What about white phosphorus?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's certainly something that we've seen used in the past, and the burns that can cause. You know, we're talking about skin. I don't want to go into too much detail at dinner time, but basically skin being eaten away and burnt down to the bone. And again, this is something that the manufacturer, even if the manufacturer is something of the past, these weapons still exist and people still hold them in their arsenals. And the more entrenched these situations become in Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan, the more likely it is for extreme weapons to be used. And don't forget, chemical weapons and biological weapons have actually been banned. So the UN needs to play a part here. The UN needs to put its finger out and actually start getting involved in looking into instances when these things might have been used.
Loads of tweets. Russell Whiting is our guest. Russell is a peace activist. He's a regular contributor to RT. Check him out on YouTube. You can find him on Twitter. It's at Russell_Whiting, and he works with groups like Campaign Against the Arms Trade and a Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Patricia tweets, if people in power don't know what this ammunition is being used for, then why the hell are they called people in power? Obviously, they're stupid people who don't have a clue. I'll tell you something that's very interesting for me, Russell, covering politics now for over 20 years in commercial radio and independent radio. When parties are campaigning for or during a general election, it's never on their manifesto, is it? It's never on the manifesto. You know,
No.
When we get in, we're going to give all of this weaponry to dodgy regimes around the world, and they're going to kill people. We're going to start undermining governments in Venezuela. We're going to start messing around in Syria. It's never on the manifesto, Russell, is it?
I mean, there's an old adage, isn't there, that elections aren't decided on foreign policy. There are no votes in foreign policy.
Yeah.
I think actually what the Labour performance in 2017 showed is that the country is ready for a radical alternative. And the Labour manifesto was radical on economics and on domestic policy to a certain extent. But the thing missing was any kind of radicalism on foreign policy. We know Corbyn believes it. We know John McDonnell believes it. We know Diane Abbott believes it. But even shortly after the election, when things were really being highlighted in the Yemen, Labour brought forward an opposition day debate to stop sales of arms to Yemen. And Labour backbenchers like John Woodcock and others didn't support it. They voted with the government against their own party to make sure that we can carry on selling arms to Saudi Arabia. So in a way, this is a kind of institutional problem that we have. When Jeremy Corbyn talks about things like getting rid of Trident, which is a Cold War relic of a weapon that's going to cost us over £200 billion to replace at a time when we've got no money, allegedly, people say, oh, he's not a serious politician. When you're a serious politician, you have to make difficult decisions. Well, difficult decisions is political code, is it not, for spending other people's money on things that they don't want.
Yeah,
Nobody wants nuclear weapons in this country except the people who are making money from it.
That's right. Sorry to interrupt you, Russell. I reckon I'm in Manchester, you're in Nottingham. I think you are in Nottingham this evening.
Yes.
Anyway. We go around, you go out to Radford, I go out to Moss Side, which is only around the corner. We knock on doors, regular folk, working class people like us, knock on the door and say, hey, listen, do you want nuclear weapons or do you want that money to be spent on, programs, house building and stuff? They're going to say house building and programs all day long. On the Corbyn thing, look, I'm a socialist, but I'm a genuine socialist. I kind of style my politics is kind of. I'm certainly, my thinking is the Simon Bolivar thinking, right? That's where I come from. Now, I always ask this to Labour Party supporters, or to those who, if push came to shove, would choose the Labour Party. Fair play to you for saying that. It was absent from the Labour Party manifesto. I've got friends in the Stop the War Coalition, people that have come on this programme in the past, Lindsay German and people like that.
Yeah.
Are peace activists, and thank God there are people like you, and I really mean that, Russell, have you been very disappointed by what's not been said by those Labour front bench grandees that you mentioned since they came to power? Because the excitement when Corbyn won the leadership election, people thought, right, we're going to get a lot of talk about these issues, hasn't materialised. Is there a lot of disappointment?
I have been hugely disappointed with elements of what Corbyn has done on foreign policy. We had the debate on replacing Trident in 2016. He was arguably at the peak of his popularity within the Labour Party. The government brings forward this motion to build 4 new submarines, £200 billion, illegal under international law, by the way, and our international obligations. And what does he do? He gives Labour MPs a free vote.
Yeah.
Well, that was when he should have stood up and said, I have won the leadership. I am in charge now. You know, Tony Blair wouldn't have given people a free vote. People would have still broken the whip. That's fine. But at least you could have flushed them out. I think one of the big problems and one of the big mistakes that was made by the Corbyn team was trying to build this shadow cabinet of all the talents originally. Right? He had Hilary Benn as Foreign Secretary, didn't he?
He did indeed.
How did Hilary Benn repay him? He stood up and made one of the most appalling speeches I've ever heard in the House of Commons on the eve of the bombing of Syria, and got a standing ovation for, you know, hooray, let's go to war. I mean, this, as you say, this is not what working class people want. But unfortunately, at a time of a general election, we get so obsessed and so focused on the NHS and education that we forget foreign policy. Now, this is not to say that domestic issues are not important, but I am just as concerned about the schools and hospitals in Afghanistan and in Yemen than I am in Nottingham and Manchester, because the people in that country and those countries are just as valuable as human beings as you or I and any of your listeners.
They have a human right to life. They have a right to pursue happiness. They have a right not to be bombed out of existence for nothing, for a myth, for a pack of lies. We can talk about Syria now. We can segue into Syria. Would Syria have collapsed were it not for the intervention of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin? I just want to mention this. It amazes me. Many years ago, about 10 or so years ago, 11 years ago, the United Nations was very, very complimentary about Syria, saying it was a terrific country, very forward-thinking, and it was meeting its millennial goals. And Asma Assad and Bashar al-Assad were kind of fated in the international community. And around about that time, a guy called Roland Dumas, who used to be the French foreign minister, he was French foreign minister under Francois Mitterrand. Around about that time, Dumas says, he said this in, I think he admitted this in 2011 or 2012. He said that he was in London and he was being told that there was going to be a movement against Syria, that a proxy war was going to be fought there, jihadists were going to be armed, and did he want to play some part in it? This is all true. People can look this up. It isn't a lie. RT have reported on this. Nobody else has. This has never been mentioned on the BBC or anywhere else. Syria would have fallen like Iraq if it wasn't for Russia. How do you see where Syria is now? And what about the part? How big a part do you feel this government in this country, our government, is playing in trying to undermine the Assad government? What do you think?
I mean, Syria is obviously in a mess because it's been bombed from so many sides for 7-8 years now. I think you are right that without the intervention from the Russian government and the military support they gave to Assad, it would have collapsed. It would now be a failed state, like the failed state that we see in Libya. And what do we know about failed states? Well, they create a vacuum that in a lawless society, the kind of most brutal and the most awful people rise to the top. And that's kind of what's happening in Libya, although it's not reported, well, hardly ever over here, actually, the terrible situation in Libya. And that's what's happened and has happened in the past in Afghanistan. Now, I am opposed to any military intervention from any side in support of any cause. The Russian government has obviously had its own problems in Syria, but I think the big problem that the UK government had is we never actually decided whose side we were on, did we? In 2013, David Cameron wanted to go in and bomb the Assad regime, which would have actually probably helped ISIS. Then 3 years later, we go in and we bomb ISIS, which does help the Assad regime, but we still don't like the Assad regime. The problem is that these are really technical, really complicated issues. But by the way, some of them, in the case of Iraq, go back to British colonial involvement in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
And our legacy there that is nothing to be proud of for sure. The answer that our government always has is fire up the jets, drop a few bombs, and we'll be fine. that's never the answer. The answer always has to come through a political solution. Look what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment. The Taliban are coming into peace talks. Now, I'm sure you, and everyone else listening can agree that the Taliban are some pretty unsavory people for what they've done. But you still have to talk to these people, because no conflict in human history has ever been solved without coming to a political solution. And whether we like Assad or not, he has to be part of the solution for Syria, because he is a political actor there. And rather than drop bombs, we should have been trying to engage him and other parties in the war in peace talks. And we should have been doing that, frankly, from 2011, not waiting until 2015, 16, whenever those talks started in Geneva.
That's right. I mean, my personal feeling about Syria is, and, it's my opinion, I'm not influenced by anybody, and I've looked at it closely, is that the Arab Spring was, for want of a better way of putting it, was a kind of a false flag kind of an operation. These so-called moderate rebels never existed. Assad was confronted out of the blue with a bunch of head-chopping lunatics in his country, whom were coming through Saudi Arabia, trained and armed by the intelligence agencies of Western countries like ourselves, like France, like the United States, and like Israel. And that's what he was faced with. I really do believe, even though his father definitely had a lot to answer for, and nobody wants authoritarian regimes. People should have a better system of government than that. Assad was a reluctant president, wasn't he, Russell? Because he only got the job because his brother died. He was an ophthalmologist. I believe that he did really want to. I believe that Assad, left alone, wouldn't be in power now, would have exited stage left. That's just my opinion. And you feel free to disagree with that and shoot me down. But that's how I feel about it.
To be honest, Rich, I don't know enough about him and his background to agree or disagree with that. But I'm sure I would like to think that he is not the kind of person who took power hoping that this was going to be the outcome of his reign.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. Look, like I said, and there are people who would disagree with me, and I've had them on the programme before. Nobody's an angel, and the Syrian army has committed unspeakable atrocities against people. And this is the thing that people can't get their heads round. Those who are on the side of Syria, they want to ignore that. You can't ignore that, because when war starts, regardless of who started it, regardless of who's right and who's wrong, people do unspeakable things, and no one side is completely innocent of that. That's fair to say, Russell.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so often in the West, it is portrayed as this side good, this side bad, and if only we drop bombs on the bad people, then the good people will win and good will prevail. But that's never the case. Like you say, we've all got a bit of good in us, and we've all got a bit of bad in us.
Absolutely. We've got a few minutes left. I'm interested in you, Russell. How did you get into it? I'm always sad when I speak to somebody like you. Sad because you go out there and you spend your free time doing it. You go out and you protest and you march. You hand leaflets out. You speak to people quietly and intelligently, trying to get people to pay attention to what's going on. And I should be happy seeing that when I come across it in Manchester and elsewhere, but it makes me sad because I think you're a kind of a lone voice. How did you get into it, and where do you see yourself in the future? Where do you see yourself and the other peace activists you work with? Yeah,
so I got into it in 2003, the Iraq War. I was 17 at the time. I was in sixth form at high school. And I was just chatting with a friend one day, and we were talking, we were trying to put ourselves in the situation of 17-year-olds in Iraq. And they knew this was coming. They knew war was coming, and they couldn't do anything about it. And I turned to him and I said, if we were in that situation and other people could do something about it, we would want them to. So we started organising. We organised a walkout as part of the school strike there. And that's how I got involved in the peace movement. Then I worked for a brief time for Christian CND before we moved back to Nottingham, and for CND as well. I'm involved with local CND and local Stop the War groups up here. But really, where I see the peace movement going, unfortunately, we're going to be needed more and more. I think the more that Donald Trump comes under pressure at home, the more likely it is that we'll see some kind of intervention against Iran. And for sure, Britain would probably support that, even though we're still trying to uphold the nuclear deal. I think the biggest problem we have, and you've highlighted it today, is a lack of awareness and a lack of education among people. We have it drilled into our heads from so early in this country that we need nuclear weapons to keep us safe, that the British Army is a heroic force for good in the world. And it never does, even in the House of Commons last week, right? The Northern Ireland Secretary saying what happened in Northern Ireland
wasn't criminal
by the British Army weren't a crime.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just nonsense. But it's the kind of stuff that gets put around and it becomes accepted wisdom. And then to challenge it, to stand up and say, should we be bombing these countries? Should we be selling these people weapons? Should we be spending £200 billion on nuclear weapons? All of a sudden, we're the wacky people. We're the people who are out of step. I think actually the people in this country who want peace, the people around the world who just want to live together and get on and accept people's differences and kind of rub along and do the best we can, are actually in the overwhelming majority. It is the political class, as so often, are the ones who need to have their minds changed.
Yeah, you've just described brilliantly how inverted the world is. Russell, thanks for giving us your time today. I really appreciate it. I know you're a Christian and a dad. I'd like to speak maybe sometime in the future about, I've had a couple of emails from Christians who say that, in this era of political correctness and people being scared of saying anything lest they offend anyone, I've had one or two Christians get in touch with me saying that everybody is protected from offence except Christians. It seems to be open season on Christians in this country, which is supposedly a Christian country. We might get into that sometime for an interesting discussion. Thanks for coming on today. It's very important work you're doing. More power to you at the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the campaign against the arms trade. You can follow Russell on Twitter. It's at Russell_Whiting. And if you go to RT.com, if you go to RT on YouTube, you'll see Russell's various appearances on there, which are very interesting. Thanks, mate. Really appreciate you coming on.
Cheers, Richie. Speak to you again soon.
Look after yourself. That was Russell Whiting live on the line to us there from Nottingham. Very important stuff, folks. This no coverage of this whatsoever. The United Nations, outside of Russia Today and Time magazine, the fact that 100 or 150 civilians and often many children killed in Yemen by weapons fired from Saudi planes given to them by this government, who have also given them the tactical nous to use those weapons and have sent officers to the control rooms in Riyadh and elsewhere to make sure that these weapons are being used properly. It's coming up for 2 minutes to the top of the hour. This is the Richie Allen Show. We're live on Fab Radio 2, triggerwarning.tv, TuneIn Radio, and my website, richieallen.co.uk. Tom Quiggin has checked in from Canada, which is great. We'll speak with Tom in a few minutes' time. Lots to get into with him. Look forward to your tweets. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. Before we do that, though, before we go any further, let's catch up with the headlines from FSN, because we're approaching the top. I know we're not quite at the top of the hour, but we're approaching the top of the hour. Let's head over to FSN for the headlines. Why not?
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett. UK MPs will vote later on whether they want to leave the EU with no deal in place. India's joined a growing list of countries that have grounded Boeing 737 MAX aircraft after the Ethiopian Airlines crash. At least 8 children have been killed by a building collapse in Lagos in Nigeria. And disgraced Catholic Cardinal George Pell has been sentenced to spend a maximum of 6 years in prison for abuse.
Yeah, George Pell. Didn't follow that really, did we, as much as maybe some people thought we would. You are, as I said, with the Richie Allen Show. Tom Quiggin coming up in a couple of seconds' time. Lots of interesting stuff on the programme tomorrow as well. I'll tell you a bit more about that a bit later on. In the meantime, let's just move on.
The Richie Allen Show relies on your support. Go to richieallen.co.uk and set up a monthly donation today.
Yes, I know I get hammered sometimes for not reading the tweets. I'm going to read a few tweets. Lots of tweets coming in there. Hi to Base Ninja. A lot of talk there about about politicians and their stance on anti-war and whether these politicians are sincere or not. Very interesting to hear Russell, who would be a Labour Party supporter, acknowledging the disappointment among those on the left that there hasn't been very much rolling against or standing up to this by the Corbyn-led Labour Party in the 3 or so years that he's had that position. You know, I've never been one of those snarky people or one of those smarmy people who says, I told you so. I've never done that because it's not helpful, but I told you about Jeremy Corbyn. You know, I saw the joy, the hysteria, especially among the anti-war left when this guy came in, because as a backbencher, he was so heavily involved in anti-war movements, so heavily involved in pro-Palestine movements and all the rest of it. And it was felt, of course, when he came in, it was hallelujah. But look, again, I'm not going to say I told you so, you know. Interesting about the manifestos, isn't it? Interesting about knocking on people's doors and asking them, hey, you know, would you support spending billions of pounds on developing nuclear weapons, or would you prefer that money was spent on building affordable social housing that would always be owned by the state and always kept and made available to people on very low incomes? What do you think the person at the doorstep is going to say? They're going to say, well, obviously spend the money on improving our neighbourhoods and building more houses, of course. Hi to Hugh Bertes, how you doing, mate? Hi to Rich, hi to Patrick, hi to David Stanford, to everybody. Hi to Charlotte in Burnley. How you doing, Charlotte? Hi to Celia Moore, who says, we are constantly complicit in this sort of massacre in Yemen. The ministers involved should be dragged screaming to The Hague. Our government should be made to release end user certificates for arms sales. Thanks for that, Celia. Well, the International Criminal Court in The Hague doesn't deal with anybody apart from those who are accused of crimes in Africa. Isn't that right, usually? Has there ever been? Well, apart from Eastern Europe, of course, as well. Has anybody else in Northern Europe or Western Europe ever been brought to The Hague in recent times? Correct me if I'm wrong. Time for some more music while we get Tom Quiggin on the phone. This is Soft Cell, going way back now. Can't wait to catch up with Tom Quiggin. He joins us after this. Back in a couple of minutes. You're with the Richie Allen Show. 5 minutes past the hour, 6:05 here in Manchester. Soft Cell, Tainted Love on the Richie Allen Show. Broadcasting live, of course, Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. UK time. And Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. UK time as well with Sunday View. Looking forward to hearing from my next guest. He was on the programme before and we liked him, so it's good that he's coming back. And there's a bit of synchronicity going on today. Just before we say hello to him again, let me read you from the BBC website. Canada has joined the ban on the Boeing crash aircraft. That's the headline. Canada has grounded the world's third largest fleet of Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft following the crash of an Ethiopian Airlines jet on Sunday. Canada's regulator said that 3 Canadian airlines operating 41 of the planes would be unable to use them in Canada's airspace. Canada says, or I should say Canada joins a long list of countries to stop the aircraft's use, but the US regulator says, in fact, it's safe to fly. Now, my guest hosts the popular Quiggin Report. Very interesting, very well produced programme. And he's also the author of Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America. But he told me today, and I didn't know this, that he has worked as an aeroplane engine technician, and he's also been air crew. And he's got some very interesting things to say about this particular airplane. Let's welcome back to the programme Tom Quiggin. Tom, welcome back. How are you?
Good to talk with you again, Richie. Sorry to hear you got banned on YouTube, although I see you're back there now. The Quiggin Report also got banned on YouTube. I think we were hit by their algorithms, but anyway, whatever. Good to be here talking to you again, sir.
Good to have you back, Tom. You're in Ottawa. Very interesting that in a past life or a recent life, you've worked as a technician and worked on aeroplanes. So this Ethiopian plane crash, horrible thing, Tom. I'm not a good flyer. I'm nervous when I fly. I hate hearing about airplane crashes. people are banning it. There were airplanes refused entry to UK airspace yesterday. But you think that the media is missing something about what might be right or what might be wrong with these planes. What's going on, Tom?
Well, the story is starting to come out, but it's pretty fragmented. But a bit of quick background, just for you, the nervous flyers, and some other folks. The 737 has been in production since 1964, I think it was. And it's the world's most popular airliner in terms of numbers built, and it's probably the world's safest airliner. What's actually happened, though, is the 737 MAX 800 and the MAX 900 are actually totally different aircraft than the old 737 series. They look similar to the outside eye, but they have different engines. They've got carbon fiber, new flight controls. Everything about them is different and improved over the old systems. But there's a couple of issues here. The first thing is, of course, everybody wants better fuel efficiency. So the 737 MAX 800s deliver. They're about 14% more fuel efficient than the series before them. So that's really good. But in order to make that happen, they had to make the engines actually larger. These are what are called high bypass turbofans, and they had to increase the fan size at the front of the engine. So in layman's terms, all that means is the engine got to be a bigger diameter. But when they putting the engines on the aircraft, they realized they have to put the engines higher and further forward than the old engines. So here's what kind of happens is the aircraft flies differently than the older models of it. So the folks at Boeing knew this was going to happen. So in order to stop the nose from pitching up, which it was doing, they installed something called a maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. And that's just a whole bunch of fancy language for an angle of attack sensor and some software changes to the flight computer. So here's what happens. If the aircraft is flying along under stress, so let's say takeoff, landing, or it's turning sharply in mid-flight for whatever reason, the aircraft has a tendency to pitch up. Now, this angle of attack sensor will talk to the flight computer. The flight computer will talk to the pitot tubes. They'll measure air density, airspeed, all this stuff. And they'll actually make a decision to push the nose of the aircraft back down again. And chances are the pilot won't even notice it. It occurs automatically. The aircraft remains stable. This is all good. However, pause for effect, as we say, there's a problem. If this angle of attack sensor fails, or if the flight computer is getting bad information from the other systems, it will falsely sense that the nose is pitching up and tell the flight computer to push the nose down, which it does. Now, here's what's happening. The pilot's flying along doing their thing, and they think everything's normal. All of a sudden, the aircraft goes nose down on them. And of course, if they're just in the process of taking off or turning, this causes them a lot of stress. So of course, automatically, they try to pull the nose up. The aircraft pushes the nose down, and they're literally getting into a fight with the aircraft over whether it should go up or down or not. So you referred to the Ethiopian air crash, which is what appears to have happened. The plane crashed not long after takeoff. But there was also the Lion Air crash about 6 months ago in Indonesia, where the same thing happened. The aircraft took off. Everything was going good. And then the cockpit recorder says that the pilots were like yelling and screaming, trying to get the aircraft to go down when it wanted to go up, up when it wanted to go down. And eventually the aircraft pushed itself into the ocean and killed everybody. Now, what's not getting into the media a lot, but it will get into the investigation, is the flight before that. The Lion Air flight before it crashed had the same problem. The passengers on that flight said it was like being on a roller coaster for the whole flight. The pilot said that they had a continuing series of failures, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They kept engaging and disengaging the computer. They kept engaging and disengaging the autopilot, finally got the aircraft under control, and they landed it. So when it landed, they took a look at the angle of attack sensor. They look at this maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. They tried repairing a couple of things, and they said, hey, it looks good to us. It seems good. The next flight, it went out and it killed everybody. So it looks like here's what's happening, is the sensors are in disagreement with the computer. The computer is making a decision to push the nose down, and the pilots are fighting that, trying to get the nose to come back up. Now, here's the killer bit that's just coming out in the news in the last couple of days. It would appear that some of the airlines that got this aircraft, the flight manuals that they used to train the pilots did not discuss about this nose popping up problem or the nose dropping down problem, and the pilots weren't trained on how to defeat it. if the pilots know how to defeat this system, there are systems they can turn off. The airplane goes back to sort of a more neutral flight, and then they control it. But bottom line is, it seems like there's an actual issue here with the pilot fighting the technology, and the pilots in a couple of cases have lost. And in at least 2 other cases in America, it looks like the pilots won the battle and were able to land the aircraft. So there's kind of the first thing. The second thing is, this is an interesting situation in that technology is taking humans out of the decision-making loop and making decisions for us. So when we get into high stress situations, most of the time, the technology decisions are correct. But if they're wrong, the systems have become so advanced in some cases, the human can't defeat the system, can't turn the system off, and you wind up with a negative outcome, i.e. everyone gets killed. So
wow, this is important, Tom.
A lot of discussions.
Repeat that again, will you? This is really important. This is the really interesting angle of it. So the technology.
Yeah, this is the interesting part. So technology in many cases is trying to take human beings out of the decision-making loop. And a lot of times in high stress situations, when things are going wrong quickly, technology can frequently make better decisions than human beings, but not always. So in these particular cases, when the pilots get into trouble, the system is so advanced and so complicated, they can't turn it off. They can't figure out how to defeat it. So they actually lose the technology battle. And in this case, everyone gets killed. Tesla, by the way, is having the same problems with their cars. Their sort of semi-autonomous driving systems on occasion seem to fail, and the cars have driven at full power into the back end of, for instance, in America, one drove into the back end of a fire truck at full power. And the driver said he couldn't defeat the systems on board. He couldn't regain control of the car. So we're at this point with technology now, whether it's your car, your motorcycle, your fridge, your computer, whatever, has so much technology in it, we're actually starting to lose control of it. And I think this particular series of crashes is going to have 2 effects. One is Boeing's going to have to take a long, hard look at how this thing is put together. But there's going to be a larger discussion on who's actually in charge of flying the airplane. Who's in charge of technology? Should it be the computer or the human being?
What about pilot unions around the world? I would imagine that experienced men and women who've had thousands and thousands of hours flying time under their belts, they must be absolutely screaming about this, saying, listen, we should be flying the plane. We have to be flying the plane. Is that happening amongst pilots, Tom?
Yes, that discussion's been going on for quite a while. It's been going on for a lot of years, actually. The discussion is, at what point can the pilot literally push a button, kill the technology, and regain control? Now, back when aircraft were actually controlled by flight controls, that is to say there were hydraulics and cables that went the length of the aircraft. So when the pilot pulled back on the stick, it actually changed the elevators on the tail end of the aircraft through a series of hydraulic systems and through a series of cable systems. At that point, you could actually cancel out the technology, turn it off, and fall back on the mechanical systems. The thing with the airline now is, when you look in the cockpit of an airplane, you see a pilot sitting there with a yoke and a couple of pedals and this and that. The reality is, it's like a Game Boy console. There are no actual linkages between the controls and the control surfaces on the wings of the aircraft. It's all done by wires and by computers. So the question is, what technology can you turn off? Can you reboot the computer and this sort of stuff? And I think we've got to a point now where we're gonna have this discussion more frequently.
Wow.
The pilots, of course, want absolute control at the end of the day, and you understand why. The technology people say, no, 99 times out of 100, we can do a better job. So here we are.
Wow, Tom. Hey, listen, one quick question on this before we swiftly move on. I want to get your thoughts on Brexit. You made me laugh yesterday when you tweeted. Your listeners will be interested in a voice from the colonies on Brexit. That made me laugh. So we'll get a voice from the colonies. Tom is in Ottawa, Canada, at Quiggin Report on Twitter. Tom Quiggin, there's only one Tom. The podcast, I Don't Lie, it's very, very well produced. It will have opinions, and there will be things said that might annoy you because you listen to your champagne socialist friend Richie. But listen to people who disagree with us. It's very important. You might learn something. Tom, is there something, this is a loaded question, of course, is there something called the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot? Because a pilot friend of mine says there is a system whereby a plane can be taken away from the pilot from the ground. Is this true? Go on, Tom, tell the truth.
Okay.
It is true, isn't it?
The way you've just put that,
yeah.
The question arises, can a guy on the ground with a joystick take control of the aircraft and fly it? against the express will of the pilot. And my understanding of the situation is that at this point, the answer is no.
Okay.
If you ask a different question, however, and say, could you build an airliner in such a way that a person on the ground could take control of the aircraft and force it to move in a direction, fly it, or even land it? Then the answer is yes, that technology is already there. They're called drones. It's already happening. So I don't think we've got to a point yet where the pilots and the airlines would allow a ground controller to seize control of an aircraft.
Can I tell you why, Tom? Can I tell you why?
It's a fair question.
Yeah, can I tell you why I asked that? Somebody whom is often accused of being a crank. I've got to be fair. If you're going to do radio, you've got to tell the truth. But I don't think he's a crank. I think he's really interesting. He's very eccentric. A man called Field McConnell. You might have heard of Field. He's flown everything. He's a US Navy veteran, all legitimate, every plane ever, tested planes, flew planes. He's flown every commercial plane ever, Field McConnell. And he describes himself as a whistleblower. Field is convinced that this technology exists. He's convinced that some pilots, but not all pilots, are aware of it. And he's gone on the record as saying that the pilots whom are aware of it should have their wings taken away because they shouldn't get on any plane where this technology is installed because they can't honestly tell the passengers, listen, I'm the guy, or she's the guy, she's the girl that's in charge of the plane. And Field has linked this to some very strange air crashes over the years, ones that have been unexplained. That's the reason I asked. It was a loaded question.
Okay, so let me just address, where did the question come from? When did we first start talking about this? And this whole discussion about seizing control of aircraft mid-flight and then redirecting them, it's a 9/11 thing. One of the things people said, they said, look, with all the technology out there, if some terrorist wherever gets into an airplane and is able to take control of it and flies it off by himself, why don't we have the technology where we flip a switch, the computer takes control and flies the airplane back the other way? And that was a reasonable question that people asked and said, why don't we do that? So is the question out there? Yes, it is. Does the technology exist to do that? Yes, it does. I'm personally not aware of anybody who says that the aircraft actually now has an A-B switch in it where it can either be the pilot controls it or the ground controller controls it.
Fair enough. We'll leave that there, Tom. Thanks for answering that. Very interesting. And your report there on what's happened with these 737s was absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot listening to that. And it's scary to think that pilots are in an ongoing battle with their own airlines and with Boeing and other aircraft manufacturers to keep control of the planes in the advent of technology. That's brilliant that you've explained that. I really appreciate that. Now, you're in the colonies. You're watching the Brexit mess with great interest. We're not leaving, Tom. We were never going to be allowed leave. How are you reading this from afar?
Okay, so we've been watching this Brexit thing for 3 years now, and this is it's interesting to us because Canada has two historical parents. Britain and France are our two historical parent countries. Most of our legal systems, culture, whatever, derives from that. So we watch France with the Yellow Vest movement going one direction. We watch Brexit and like, oh boy, there that goes. And this Brexit thing's been going on for 3 years now, I think it is, or whatever. So when I travel in Europe, which I do a bit still, and I see someone who looks or sounds like a Brit, I'll plead stupid colonialist and just say, I don't really understand this whole Brexit thing. Explain it to me. And what I get two sets of answers. The folks who seem to be in favor of remaining in the European Union always seem to come up with financial arguments. It's about money. It's about the city. It's about the pound, the value of the pound sterling. It's about trade. It's about this. It's about that. However, folks who are in favor of leaving the European Union, in other words, I guess the Brexiteers or whatever you call them, the arguments they normally produce are social structure, law, crime, sovereignty, safety, the European Court of Human Rights, over-centralization of government, over-centralization of bureaucrats, the dead hands of the bureaucrats in Brussels, and those kinds of arguments. And what's fascinating to me sitting over here is we also watch the discontent growing in France, and we see the same thing, that the French are literally on the streets rioting at the moment. And we see some parallels. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, it's not like Labour's in favor of it and the Conservatives are against it, or I guess vice versa, whatever. But both parties are heavily split over whether they should do the Brexit thing or not. in the sense that the parties now don't have a key idea of how they represent people on this issue. Same in France. The people there are angry, they're discontented, they're getting sometimes violent, and there is no single party that represents their interests, much as the same way there's no single party in the United Kingdom right now that can say they're for or against Brexit. And we see the same thing happening here in Canada. Folks are really tired of looking at the Liberals, they're not happy with them, but they're not thrilled with the Conservative either. So I sort of see this breakdown in the party system as being quite significant. The Tories haven't delivered Brexit. I'm not sure that Theresa May ever planned on doing it.
No.
She seems to be a standard modern day politician where you straddle the fence firmly, promise everything while delivering as little as possible in order to meet your own stated requirements. But I think it's going to blow up on her. And for Labour, I mean, they haven't exactly covered themselves in glory on this one either. And I think it's a message to politicians that it's no longer like a left-right thing a lot of the time. Now it's more kind of a globalist versus localist. It's kind of a elitist financial class versus, production workers and homeowners and that sort of stuff. It's more of a elitist class versus the lower middle class kind of thing, but it's not breaking along left-right terms like most issues have historically. So I think Europe as a whole, Canada, America, we're all going through this same sort of issue that globalization is forcing things on us and we're not really ready to respond to it. And the political parties are, well, to be a bit blunt, sometimes they just appear clueless as to how they should react to these kinds of things. I do think that if Brexit's going to occur, it's going to be a crashing out. If Brexit doesn't occur and there's a recession anyway, which I do think we're going to get a recession in the next 6 months to a year or whatever, then I think the potential for social unrest in the United Kingdom is very high, and I think the potential for social unrest in France is also very high.
You must be, sorry Tom, you must be a clairvoyant, because that was my next question. Tonight, they're voting at Westminster on whether to take no deal off the table, which is obviously patently ridiculous. Why would you take out of a negotiator's hand the right or the opportunity, if necessary, to walk away? This is madness. So in the event that we don't leave, which we won't, I said on the 24th of June 2016 we'd never leave, and I don't get a lot of things right, but I knew that would never be allowed to happen because I believe the European Union is a very strong pillar of a future one world, sovereign, free, no sovereign countries in the world. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. I was going to ask you, if it doesn't materialise, which it won't, what will be the reaction in the UK? You think that people might take to the streets and it might not be a token gesture, it might be something more serious?
Yeah, I mean, British history or English history, depending how you look at it, there's been a few ups and downs over the years. There's been a lot of violence in British history. There's been a lot of riots on the street dating back, for centuries. But I think right now, the folks who are driving the Remain campaign, like you say, they're captured by this European Union kind of dream sort of ideal or whatever. And I'm not really opposed to much of what they're doing. It sounds good in practice, but unfortunately you have a lot of people who are watching their neighborhoods change. They're watching their standard of living drop. They're watching violence in the street. They're getting mugged by guys on mopeds. They're getting sprayed with acid. And they're saying, hey, you know what? Enough is enough. How come the United Kingdom can't run the United Kingdom anymore? How come we're getting like several 100,000 migrants every year who seem to be substantially changing the population? Oh, yeah, by the way, we're told we have to accommodate their values and their systems. And I think there is genuine anger at the middle class, the lower middle class in that area. And if that is combined with a recession, now we get recessions on a regular basis, every 10, 12, 15 years, whatever, we're going to get a recession. And most of the folks who watch this kind of stuff say the next recession could actually get pretty ugly. So if you wind up a situation where there's no Brexit and at the same time a bad recession, that is to my way of thinking, it's a strong potential for social unrest of the rock and bottle throwing kind. And I mean like actual sustained violence in the street, much more so than you had a few years ago. Same goes for France, by the way. I think France is actually in worse shape than the United Kingdom, and the potential for street violence there is also significant, as we've seen with the Yellow Vest movement, which is now on Act 18, is it, I guess?
Yeah. The worry for me, Tom, is that if there is social unrest, that the people will turn their wrath on the wrong target, that they will turn against the ethnic minorities who, you know, it's not their fault that we wrecked and sacked Libya and Syria and Afghanistan. You know, I'm not saying there are not some bad characters amongst those migrants. Of course there are, and this is all very serious as well. But most of these people are oblivious to what's happening. My big fear is people will turn on them rather than turn on the institutions that created the problem in the beginning. Go ahead.
Yeah. So here, exactly. Here's the issue. When you get a significant downturn, when the pie shrinks and people get angry, quite often you'll get a charismatic leader who will emerge, and they will blame the state for what's going on. They'll blame the institutions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you always wind up with this discussion of the other. And it will be the other that gets it in the neck. So in Germany in the 1930s, the other was the Jews.
Yeah.
In Rwanda and Burundi, it's the Hutu or the Tutsis, depending which side of the line you're on. And of course, 800,000 people die. When I was in the war in Yugoslavia, the Serbs thought it was the Croats thought it was the Serbs, and it's the other that gets it in the neck. So yeah, exactly. The fear is if you get a charismatic leader who calls for violence, they will ultimately get around to blaming the other. And my suggestion here is politicians need to really shake their heads, get out of their stupidity, and start looking at actual real social issues on the ground and fix them now. Fix immigration, fix migration, fix housing, fix schools. Because if you don't fix this stuff now, when there gets to be a real problem, it's going to be impossible to fix. And yeah, you're going to get the problem with government. Government goes from no action to overreaction. Same with the mob. They go from anger to overreaction. And yeah, it'll be some brown guy named Ahmed who gets it in the neck, even though it's not actually his fault.
Fair play to you, Tom. That's really important. Tom can be found on Twitter at Quiggin Report, but also at Tom TSEC. Check him out, folks. He's making an excellent program there. He's written a book about political Islam as well. I'll tweet a link out to that. We talked about that last time Tom was on. Tom, sometimes people like you and me, we get accused of over-exaggerating a single story. And in some cases, maybe I can look to the past and think sometimes, yeah, I've been a bit guilty of making a mountain out of a molehill. But when the police, Tom, are called to go and see a lecturer, I want to bring this story up because it's very important. I was going to talk about this at the very outset of the program, but I left it for you coming on. This incredible story about an Edinburgh University lecturer who tweeted a quote from a very funny film called Trainspotting, written by Irving Welsh. And there's a character in it called Renton, and he made a funny comment about the English. And it actually resulted in a police investigation, and it actually resulted in the police contacting this guy. There have been too many stories like that. A woman, Tom, I know you know about this. I think you talked about this on Twitter. A woman got into an argument with a transgender activist, and the woman said, look, well, I'll never accept you as a woman. And she spent 7 hours in a police cell in this country. I don't want to sound now like, again, ranting about it, but these are very dangerous times, Tom, for people's ability to say what's on their mind, right?
Indeed. Our podcast, actually, the Quiggin Report, is based on this whole idea that we need free speech on the toughest issues, and this being security, intelligence, terrorism, migration. These issues are so sensitive that you absolutely need free speech to have intelligence discussions around them to get them solved before they turn into a real mess. But I mean, just by way of example, there's an outfit in your country called the South Yorkshire Police. And they got absolutely hacked on, absolutely bombarded on social media because they actually put out a thing that says, in addition to reporting hate crimes, please report non-crime hate incidents as well, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've got now is you actually have a number of police forces in the United Kingdom, same thing over here, where they have specialist officers sitting in rooms with computers looking for what they allege to be hate speech online. Now, here's the issue. Hate speech used to mean something. In other words, like when I worked for the federal police here, we ran into this issue the odd time with hate speech as it was connected to war crimes. So somebody would say, well, that guy's a Nazi and I think he should be, thrown in jail, la, la, la. He's guilty of hate crimes. So here in Canada, the stand for a hate crime used to be you had to identify a certain group and then you had to advocate violence against them. So you couldn't say, well, I don't like gay people. That by itself is not a hate crime. But, but if you said, I don't like gay people, and I think Friday night we should go down to the gay bar and set it on fire, that constitutes a hate crime.
Justifiably,
now,
yeah.
The standard of evidence is this. If you're offended, if your feelings are offended by a comment, that constitutes hate speech. That is the standard the human rights types are using here in Canada. That's what your police forces are using. It's a disaster. It's dangerous. It needs to be fought. You are correct.
That's it. And there doesn't appear outside of the independent media to be much opposition to this. To be fair, the Daily Mail, some of our listeners would refer to it as the fail, but the Daily Mail at least highlights these incidences and puts them out there so people can make their own minds up on them. I think, again, without trying to come across as fear-mongering, I think we are very close to somebody being convicted, maybe not sent to prison, but having a conviction on their record for hate speech, for saying something as innocuous as, I don't believe you're actually a woman, or I don't believe you should be allowed to take part in that particular race because you have an advantage. I can see eventually a judge saying, yeah, that's hate. And
I think we're there.
We're there,
and
yeah.
It's interesting. The standard now is very much, and they're being taught at universities, this is part of sort of the postmodernist wave as well, that facts aren't important. It's about how you feel about the facts that's important. And if your feelings get hurt by something somebody says, well, my answer is too bad, suck it up. It's a tough world out there. And given the multiplicity of identities that everybody has, male, female, white, black, English, Scottish, Irish, whatever, there's going to be friction in society. That's why we need free speech, is discuss these kinds of issues. If you suppress free speech on these kinds of issues, what you get instead is violence in the long term. So yeah, it's dangerous. It's bad. Free speech is a hallmark of Western society. It's one we need to defend.
Good stuff. Let's talk a little bit about Jeremy Corbyn and his relationships in the past with the IRA and Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, I've been a very ardent critic of Jeremy Corbyn. I consider myself to be, an old school type of socialist, and I believe that Corbyn is a social democrat, no more, no less, and it certainly wouldn't be a socialist. I spent a lot of time criticising him over the years. However, I find it very interesting, and I'm really interested in your opinion, Tom, but a lot of people, and I don't mean to pigeonhole you now, but a lot of people whose politics might be conservative or centre-right or whatever, have been, over the years, have hammered people like Corbyn for speaking with people like Hamas and Hezbollah and the IRA. And yet a lot of those people will spend a lot of time ranting about the rights of people to free speech, the right of movement, the right of people to assemble and to talk. I know you want to talk a bit about Hezbollah being banned and Jeremy Corbyn. I've never had a problem with Corbyn speaking with the political representatives of people, regardless of whether those groups, whether it be Sinn Féin or Hezbollah, had been connected to or had committed acts of violence. The way I looked at it was the UK state, the British state, had and has and does commit acts of violence, grievous acts of violence against others all the bloody time. And if Corbyn wanted to talk with these people, he was free to do it. I get annoyed because there's so much to bash Corbyn for, genuine stuff, that he still gets hammered for speaking to these groups that later on Tony Blair and Mitchell and Clinton were happy to speak with anyway. Over to you. What do you think?
Well, let me just back up here a bit. As some of your viewers know, I'm ex-military. I spent times in wonderfully exciting places like Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia. But in the military, we actually have a question we ask about a place like Bosnia, or if you're in Cyprus or Golan Heights or wherever. And the question is this: can you kill your way out of the problem? Now, that sounds pretty blunt, but there it is. Can you kill your way out of this problem? And when you look at a problem like the IRA or Hezbollah, you ask the question, can you kill your way out of the problem? The answer is no, you can't. You cannot kill your way out of this problem. So the next answer is, I guess we need some sort of political solution or some sort of accommodation or something. So to go back to the IRA Sinn Féin kind of discussion, the IRA tried its thing for a while, didn't work out too good. British Army tried its thing for a while, thumped a bunch of guys, didn't work out too good. And eventually everybody got exhausted and said, you know what, we need to come up with some kind of solution. Now, you can't have the military talking to the IRA. That's not going to work. The folks from Westminster can't talk to the IRA because they can't be seen to be talking to terrorists. So hence you get Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin is the political wing of the IRA, and ergo you can talk to them without talking to terrorists, even though everybody knows it's the same thing. So enter Hezbollah. So the United Kingdom has just banned Hezbollah again.
Yeah.
And their argument was, and I've got some empathy for this argument, that Hezbollah is a multifaceted outfit. It's got a headquarters, it runs schools, it runs water systems, it runs hospitals, it runs financial collection systems to pay for all this. And oh yeah, by the way, it runs a bunch of fighters and suicide bombers and some other crazy stuff. So when you say, you should be able to talk to Sinn Féin in order to get some sort of an accommodation so you can get the killing stopped, I don't disagree with that. But the thing with Hezbollah is, and as the British government pointed out, it has become such a monolith of an organization that there isn't really a separation anymore between the political wing and the military wing. And worse still, they're not looking for an accommodation, they're looking for victory. And then the other problem with Hezbollah, at the end of the day, Hezbollah isn't Hezbollah. Hezbollah is Iran. They fund it, they support it, they drive it, they control it. So yeah, the one with Hezbollah is really tough. I think where Corbyn gets into trouble on this issue, and I think to a certain degree, rightfully so, he says, hey, I have to be able to talk to these guys to a certain degree in order to come to accommodation and solution. So you say, okay, a tough position, it's hard to support, but yeah, it's probably viable. But then he gets involved in all this anti-Semitism, and he actually has his picture taken with guys waving Hezbollah flags in London, and it gives the illusion that he's just way too close to the militant wing of Hezbollah, and he's not playing that role of statesman where he's trying to negotiate between two different factions. So I think that's where Corbyn gets in trouble.
Tom, can I jump in? Let me jump in because I take a different point of view here. So let me put the other side of it. I'll tell you where I am on it. I think it's very rich not for you, Tom, of course, but for the government of this country, the governments of France, the government of the United States, and the government of Israel, particularly here, to bash Hezbollah or to bash Iran for using actors in certain countries in the Middle East, when we know for decades that the aforementioned governments, the UK, France, the United States, and Israel, has been doing that very thing. We know that Israeli operatives actually treated ISIS jihadists who were wounded in Syria. This is not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. So it's unfair to say that Hezbollah has grown into something that's beyond just a political wing and say that, Iran is controlling it. Even if I totally went along with that, our governments are doing that and worse on a daily basis. So where does that leave us?
Yeah, it leads you with that sort of whataboutism kind of argument that, hey, well, that's
look, I'm
bad,
beyond that. I'm above that, Tom. Hang on. I'm not that petty. It's not whataboutery with me. It's a fact. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, so hence the question. Who do you deal with to try and come up with a solution? So with the IRA thing, everybody in the British government held their nose and they talked to Gerry Adams, even though they had some pretty low opinions of the guy. And at the end of the day, it appears, I'm being optimistic here, that the Irish problem, I wouldn't say it's been solved, but at least it's been tamped down to a level where folks have quit killing each other in large numbers. And that's a good thing, by the way.
Thank God, yeah.
So the question is with Lebanon. Who do you deal with in Lebanon as a reasonable partner, as a rational actor? And the reality is Hezbollah now has effectively taken control of Lebanon. The government of Lebanon says it's not true, but even then they admit that Hezbollah is a part of the Lebanese people, and it has people in cabinet. So, if the IRA had people in the British cabinet, I think folks would be kind of like, whoa, how do we deal with those guys? So, yeah, it's a matter of degrees. But I think, again, we're talking the Middle East here, so you're talking 5,000 years of loaded history. So trying to find a rational actor to deal with on the opposition side is incredibly difficult. And every time you find one, 10 people will jump up and say, well, you can't deal with that person.
You're right. Can I jump back in? Let me jump back in very briefly. You're right. That's a very, very salient point you've just made there. The Lebanese might say, and Hezbollah might say, it's very difficult for us to speak with the government of the UK, and it's very difficult for us to speak with the government of the US because they are so aligned with the government of Israel, and this is a country that back in 1982 deliberately murdered more than 20,000 of our civilians. You see, this is what you're up against, and that isn't nonsense by me either. Israel did that. So Hezbollah might say, we can't talk to you because that Israeli influence is always there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the role that that weird countries used to play. Canada, Norway, Sweden, that kind of stuff. There used to be a role for those folks to play the interlocutor, where we were close enough to the Americans and the Brits to hear what they were saying. We could deal with the Israelis, but you could also deal with, whichever group you were dealing with at the time. So, I mean, that used to be kind of a standard role for us. And I think, unfortunately, we've gotten away from that, which is truly unfortunate, because there is a role for that sort of aligned yet seen as slightly neutral parties such as Sweden, Norway, Canada, Switzerland, those kinds of countries. So if there is hope for this kind of stuff, I think we need to start moving in those kinds of directions. But yeah, the other thing is the West needs to learn a couple of lessons, which it constantly fails. I had no problem with people saying we should overthrow Muammar Gaddafi because the guy's an idiot. He should have been shot. But here's the problem. Every time you do that, when you break a government, the reality is you own it. You need to fix it. And what we've done is we invaded Iraq and saying, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, okay, he wasn't a great guy.
On a pack of lies.
But there was no follow-up. We got rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and there was no follow-up. Both those countries now are absolute disasters. So if you're going to invade something and destroy the government, fine. But when you break it, you own it, and you got to be able to fix it.
You know what's interesting, Tom? You know what's interesting about Libya? Look, I've got, well, not anymore, but I used to know some Libyan people in Manchester, and they were no fans at all of Muammar Gaddafi and life there. But what really is important to note is after we wrecked Libya in 2011, Obama and Cameron and the rest of them, a committee, a foreign affairs committee at Westminster here found that again the UK government was lying and the media was complicit in saying that that the Gaddafi was doing this and Gaddafi was doing that, and they downplayed the fact that a lot of the violence in Libya was actually being caused by jihadists that had nothing to do with Libya, and they admitted that, the UK government's own report on that. So I'm not saying I was any big fan of Gaddafi, but I just don't ever want to see my government ever deciding that it's okay to bomb the absolute shit out of a country back to the Stone Age and to kill the country's leader. It's up to the people of that country to decide who governs them and when, and if they want to rise up against them legitimately, without being aided and abetted by the likes of George Soros and others, if they want to do that legitimately and they need help, well, then we could look at that down the road. Back to you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm almost on that same sort of line. If you're going to get involved in these things, okay, whatever, but you've got to be prepared to follow through. One of the great ironies of all of this is when General Eisenhower and the Allies invaded Nazi Europe on D-Day in 1944. When they went ashore on day one, it was all fighting troops on day one, day two, day three. But interesting enough, a thing that never gets studied is on about the end of the first week, they started putting guys ashore who were civil administrators, because Eisenhower realized he wanted to fight the war in front of him. He didn't want to fight the war behind him. So as he went through villages and took control of them, as the troops moved on and left those villages, they left behind people who could take over the water systems, people who could run the electricity. You put the old mayor back in power, that kind of thing. So again, if you're going to do something in a foreign country, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, and we can discuss the reasons for that. But if you finally decide to do something. You've got to take control of it. You've got to be prepared to fix it. And we're not. And to that way, I would think then in that case, we shouldn't interfere in other people's governments if we're not willing to follow through. So I think you and I would probably agree at the end of the day that messing around with other people's countries is a bad idea.
Yeah, and it costs an absolute bloody fortune, money that can be used domestically. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, first of all, I've got to mention again, if you've just joined the programme, Tom Quiggin is our guest, former soldier. Tom, a brilliant podcast and radio show host. He's an author as well, at Quiggin Report on Twitter, and you can also find Tom, if you put Tom Quiggin into Twitter, you'll find his personal account. Great to get your perspective, Tom. I wanted to ask you this. Are you hearing anything on the wind about the regulation of what it is that you do? Because this year, coming this year, the UK government is going to attempt to regulate totally independent programs like mine. This is a horrifying reality for independent content creators, producers and broadcasters. Are you getting any whiff in Canada that someday soon somebody might say, Mr. Quiggin, you need to have a license to do that? What do you think?
Yeah, what we're actually seeing is two things here in Canada. One, the Liberal government, literally, like as we speak, are planning on giving some $500 to $600 million to so-called mainstream media to help them transition from the analog stage to the digital phase. What people are actually saying is what that is about buying off the mainstream media so they get the stories right and support the government. So that's kind of going on. The other thing is we actually had the government of Canada here, and by that I mean Prime Minister Trudeau, actually went to Twitter and Facebook and had a number of parody accounts shut down.
Wow.
Because they were making a mockery of the government. And one in particular, the environmental minister here, Catherine McKenna, aka Climate Barbie, her account was so badly run and said such stupid things that people got genuinely confused between the parody account and the real account. They couldn't tell which one was being mysterious. But the government shut it down, and it was like, whoa, they're going to technology companies and having opposition voices silenced. Also, I'm aware the European Union is looking at much the same thing. It's worrisome. One quick closing thought. This goes back to a podcast we did earlier, but in the United Kingdom, there was a guy called William Anderton. He died in 1698. He died because there was a series of parliamentary acts from 1660 to about 1693, I think, that were addressing the problem of treason, unreasonable licensed books, unreasonable pamphlets, and all this sort of stuff. So as the printing press was being invented and popularized, the English government of the day was trying to control it and shut it down. And they had all these parliamentary acts which wound up failing. At the end of the day, there was a guy named William Anderton. He had a secret printing press, and he was printing Jacobean material. They found out who he was, destroyed his printing press, and then executed him for treason in 1698. And the message was clear to the people of the day. We can't control the press. We can't control printers. But we can control the advertisers, and we can kill the people we don't like who are using the printing press in a way we don't want it to be used. So that kind of message is there. That I think this is what you're seeing right now is government's becoming increasingly frustrated by its inability to deal with a bunch of issues. And the easiest thing to do is to shut down the discussion. So yeah, again, it comes back to this issue of free speech. It's important. We should be pushing harder to go the opposite direction. We should have greater free speech in times of trouble, not less. The Leveson inquiries come to mind, but that's a whole other discussion for another day.
It certainly is. And for those listening to Tom there, when you feel like today is the day to stand up for somebody's right to free speech, how about you stand up for somebody whom you disagree with fundamentally? That's the way to start. Don't go aligning yourself with somebody who feeds back to you that which you already believe. Go and stand up for the rights of somebody whom you disagree with. Tom, remind our listeners where they can hear the Quiggin Report.
It's on Patreon, it's on Stitcher, it's on SoundCloud, and it's on iTunes, and some of the ones are actually on Vimeo as well. We're not on YouTube because we've been banned. We haven't been given a reason, but we're going to try and get that corrected. But anyway, yeah, for now, Patreon, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, those are the best places to go.
You are a great listen, Tom. Thanks for giving us your time today. I look forward to doing it again. Cheers, mate.
Cheers, Richie. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Tom. That was the terrific Tom Quiggin. Tom is in Ottawa. Check him out on the platforms he just mentioned there. And he made a very good point there about free speech. Do shout loudest for the rights to free speech of those whom you most vehemently disagree with. That's the way to start, isn't it? Because you're not for free speech unless you're for everybody's right to free speech. And I know I've said that a million times there. Running battle on Twitter at the moment. I've been trying to not watch it because Tom obviously had to have my total attention there. And he did have my total attention. But it's a running battle on Twitter with some of the listeners of this programme with somebody who claims to be some sort of Zionist and is calling people anti-Semitic and all the rest of it. Somebody who tweets under the name @AgainstDenial. And the person who is tweeting under the name @AgainstDenial, who doesn't have the courage, by the way, to name himself or herself, that would be a decent thing. If you're going to be standing up for Zionism, at least let people know who you are, you know, if you're going to be trolling them. But I say to Zionists tonight, listening to the programme, as I've said 1,000 times, you are more than welcome to come on this programme at any time to speak to me about Zionism and about the state of Israel, your support for it, and why you believe that certain people are anti-Semitic. I will treat you with the utmost courtesy. I interview people all the time with whom I disagree. You will not be shouted down. You will not be ridiculed. You will not be mocked. And if you come on and debate somebody like Gilad Atzmon or somebody else, you will have equal time. And if the other person tries to interrupt you or shout you down, I will hammer them into the ground. Been doing this job for many, many years. So if you're a Zionist and you want to come on and talk about anti-Semitism, you want to talk about the Labour Party, and you want to talk about free speech, get in touch with the programme. You are more than welcome to come on. And I'm going to say for the 500th and final time, courtesy, respect, you'll be afforded it in the manner with which any self-respecting broadcaster would give it, right? This is no shock jock programme with people screaming at people and trying to silence them. There was a time, and I did mention this on the programme before, when Zionists, absolute militant Zionists, used to speak to me when I was on the radio in Spain regularly, and we would bang backwards and forwards, hammer and tongs, with respect. And I've named some of these people. They don't come on anymore. And I fear that it is because they are being told not to come on. This is the problem with these cowards in the campaign against anti-Semitism. This giddy falter arsehole, this tosser who tries to get people thrown out of venues rather than have the courage to confront the person he wants shut down. Rather than have the courage to stand in front of him and say, I disagree with you, let me tell you why. And then I will shut up and I will hear what you have to say. That's a debate. Dreadful. Dreadful. This world that we're creating here, where it's okay to go on social media and call people anti-Semitic or say they're Holocaust deniers, lying through your teeth, and then run away and not stand in front of their face and say it to them. Takes courage to stand in front of a man or a woman and say, you are this or you are that. Cowards tweet under pseudonyms, probably from the sanctity of their mother's bedrooms, rather than come up to somebody and say, I don't like you, I'll tell you why. Fair enough. That's all right. I have great respect for you for telling me that you don't like me. I really do. Fair play to you. Let's sit down. Let's have a cup of tea. Better still, let's have a beer. Tell me why you don't like me, and I'll tell you why I'm actually not that bad. Then we'll figure it out. And we'll part. Maybe not as friends, but with a mutual respect, because you had the decency to say to my face that which you are saying on Twitter or on Facebook. It's as simple as that. Fed up of it now. Fed up with these morons. You know, these morons. They are morons. That's a bit cheap, Richie. No, it's not. It's moronic to tweet and call people names using a pseudonym. Moronic. We've never had a better opportunity to speak with people whom we disagree. Never. We've got the technology. We've got the programs. We can bypass the mainstream media that gives 5 minutes to these issues. We can give an hour to it. Is an hour not enough? We'll give 90 minutes to it then. Why not? Opening statements. Opening statements. And then we'll have a conversation, right? That's it for the programme today. Massive shout out to Russell Whiting coming on the programme from Nottingham earlier on. Enjoyed listening to Russell. And Tom Quiggin as well. Really good broadcaster, Tom. Top man. Very interesting guy because of his background. And it was fascinating to hear Tom talk about the 737 issues, wasn't it? And wasn't it amazing to hear him talk about how pilots are fighting hard against the technology, because when the technology fails, it's becoming almost impossible for pilots to wrestle control of the plane back. That's something that every passenger, everybody who gets on a plane should know, and I'm glad we got into that today. I'm sure that will come up again in the future on the Richie Allen Show. Right, that's it for the programme. Thanks as always to you for listening to it and for supporting it. I really appreciate it. We'll be back again tomorrow at 5 p.m. UK time. Look after each other and yourselves.